Yeah, I just want to briefly talk about AHEC's preparations for EUDR. Just as background, I'm the Environmental Policy Director for the American Hardwood Export Council. Um, I suppose the first point I want to make is just to highlight this chart which we prepared a few months ago. It's basically showing the size of trade in all the regulated commodities under EUDR, the size of the external trade. And of course, this law was developed really to tackle deforestation driven by largely by agricultural commodities, which I think in the EUDR's introduction account for about 90% of deforestation worldwide. But actually, this law very much in terms of volumes actually targets the forest products sector. Something like 73% of all the products trade, and I'm just talking about external trade here, imports and exports are actually forest products. And the forest products imports greatly outweigh the trade in all the other commodities. And we've heard a little bit about the coverage of exports, but of course, EUDR also requires conformance at point of export from the EU. And the exports are even larger. The EU is a much larger exporter of forest products than it is an importer. And this has huge implications for the operation of this law. And actually, I have to admit, having spent 10 years monitoring the impact of EUTR in a different role, I do get a sense of unreality around the operation and the expectations with regard to the implementation of this law. I agree. I've seen a lot of very impressive technology that we've seen demonstrated. And I think in time, that will provide the solutions that we need and it's at the appropriate scale. But just at the moment, it is a question of time and scale. Can these services that are being developed actually solve all the problems with regard to EUDR implementation? I'm not yet sure that's possible. It will take time. We spent a lot of time at AHEC trying to develop a solution for EUDR conformance, which does match the requirements for scale and to try and deliver it in a certain time scale. And actually, it's been extraordinarily challenging. And we're at a point, I think, with American hardwoods where we're having to say, look, there's a zero risk of deforestation in our product group. We can demonstrate that very clearly at a jurisdictional level and at a very specific jurisdictional level, right down to the level of individual counties in the United States. We can demonstrate that. But we think we're going to struggle to actually conform to the letter of the law. We will actually struggle to comply, to demonstrate in accordance with the law because the text is actually very restrictive. So this is why we're very grateful to Sylvia for the work that she's doing. We actually do believe there needs to be a bit of a delay to implement this law. And bearing in mind that certainly in the American hardwood sector, but also in a lot of forest products sectors, we're looking at small companies all the way through the supply chain. They're companies, they're not big corporations. They're not, a lot of them in the sector that I deal with, they're small family-owned operations. They don't have understanding and knowledge of all this very impressive technology. It will take time to roll out these programs right across the industries that I'm dealing with, that we're dealing with, right across the American hardwood sector, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail as to why it's so difficult in that sector to roll it out. We will need time, and we will need a lot of training. We will need something of a delay in implementing this system, and that's even in a sector which, frankly, is very, very low risk. So what I want to do, just briefly, I haven't got a lot of time, so I'll have to whiz through this. I just want to put US hardwood into the context of the EUDR. I will explain the assurance framework for legal and deforestation-free US hardwood we are developing. There will be a system in place by the end of this year, which will demonstrate very robustly that the American hardwood delivered into the EU and into global markets is legal and deforestation-free. But it does not conform to the actual letter of the law in some important ways. And I just need to make you aware of that. And we're also involved in wider lobbying and promotion efforts. We're actually calling for specific targeted changes to EUDR. We do believe in this law. We think its objectives are absolutely right. We believe in time the technology will deliver solutions. But I think in order for this law to fly, there does need to be some very specific, very targeted changes in the text of the law. Just to put the EU in the context of the wider US hardwood export industry, the US hardwood log exports last year, they were valued at about $2.7 billion, of which 10% of that went to the EU, and incidentally 3% went to the UK. But the EU is obviously not a dominant market for us. However, it's a very, very important market. We do recognize its influence on the wider trade, both in terms of exporting environmental standards and, of course, in exporting design trends and attitudes. And we really do want to maintain access to the EU market. It's very, very important to us, very precious to the industry. But it does mean that we're going to have to do a lot of work to demonstrate compliance to EUDR, and we're not going to be fully there by the end of this year. And I think that's probably common with a lot of other industry sectors. The important feature of the American hardwood sector is actually the degree of fragmentation in the supply base. The forest resource of the United States is a resource that's not threatened with deforestation due to agriculture. Where there is deforestation, there is a bit of deforestation due to infrastructure development, which of course is not actually covered by EUDR, but conversion to agriculture, very, very small, very, very low risk. And I can show you that. Most American hardwoods, of course, come from the temperate forests of the eastern United States. If you look at this map, you'll see the eastern United States, a lot of that cover is green, and that is an indication of the vast areas which is in private forest ownership in the United States. And that's private forest. It is not typically large industry lands. Most of that is small family forest ownership. And actually, those family forests account for probably about 80% of log supply into the US hardwood sector. And there's about 9.2 million family forests. Very few of those 9.2 million family forests are certified to any system. I think we did an analysis a couple of years ago, indicated that something like 50,000 of those, 1 or 2% of the family forest owners are certified under any system. And that's because they don't have incentives to get certified. They are they will harvest only perhaps once in a generation. They own the forest. Very, very few of them actually manage the forest with an intent for timber production longer term. It's managing it for nature protection, for hunting, to pass on a property to the next generation. And they will occasionally harvest very small volumes individually of hardwoods when they need to fund something in, fund a child going to university or something of that nature. They will occasionally harvest some of their trees. This just gives you, I tried schematically to show how the hardwood supply situation works in the United States, because I think often there's often very little understanding of the degree of fragmentation in this sector, and the challenges actually of identifying individual polygons for each individual harvest. I mean, I think it's very nice, the technology that we saw earlier, but again, I don't think it's realistic for individual hardwood mills to be sitting down and trying to put little polygons around every single harvest site in the United States. Bearing in mind, a lot of these mills are very small family-owned mills. There's about 2,000 of these hardwood mills in the United States. Each of them will source their logs from maybe 100-mile radius. That covers about an area. So their supply base covers an area of about 8 million hectares. And inside that 100 million hectares, there will be several 100,000 forest properties, and they might be sourcing from perhaps 200 or 300 harvest sites every year. All those harvest sites, incidentally, or nearly all of them, are low intensity selection harvesting. So it's actually very difficult to spot using satellite data. The actual canopy cover might reduce from 100% to 60 or 70% with one of these harvests. very, very difficult to spot using at least the sort of publicly available satellite data. You need to get access to high resolution satellite data to identify these harvest sites. And the mills themselves, they will perhaps be able to identify 50% of the harvest sites from which they're sourcing wood. They perhaps buy 50% of their logs either from their company lands, or they will buy it standing from private family forest lands. But a lot of the logs come in from they're hauled to the sawmill by landowners and loggers. They might come from log brokers. So there's another step in the chain to try and identify exactly where each of those harvest sites are. And bearing in mind, there may be, 300 harvest sites one year, and then the next year it'll be a different 300 harvest sites. And all the logs that come into the mill, they are all sorted by species, size, and grade, because the hardwood forests in the United States are highly diverse. The harvests are very, very small. So you have to aggregate logs from a lot of different small harvests, sort them by species, size, and grade. There's a lot of mixing. And then there will be further sorts after sawing and drying the lumber. And then when it gets to the actual export of those products into the international market, it becomes even more complicated, because a lot of the wood exported from the United States, the hardwood exported, is exported through an exporting company, a company that in global terms is actually quite small. It would probably be classed as a medium-sized enterprise under the EU's categories. But this is just an example, which I was speaking to a guy who worked for one of these mid-sized exporting companies only a few months ago, and he said, well, he has about 80 or 100 supplying mills. They will have access. They will be sourcing from several million forest properties. That would be the total wood basket. And there would be every year at least, up to 15,000 or 30,000 different potential harvest sites distributed across several states. And this exporter will also mix and sort products from different mills in order to match customer specifications. So we are very dependent. If we would be very dependent on this in excess system, which we heard explained earlier on. However, the problem with that is that, as Sylvia explained very articulately earlier on, if you get one of those properties happens to be deforested in the future, then everything you're sourcing from all 30,000 different properties, everything is classed as deforestation. And bearing in mind that you're sourcing your wood from family forest owners over which you do not have direct control, and they will be responding to economic signals. They may, one or two of them may sell their land to a farmer in order to grow soy and the rest of it. How can the mill actually prevent that if it's a small family forest owner? So the legal liabilities on American hardwood suppliers into the EU providing data at an individual property level are enormous, even though, I will show in a minute, the risks of deforestation in this supply region are extremely small. So this is just showing the EU's own data from the observatory, which they've set up, obviously, to support the EUDR implementation. And actually, this data shows that the risk of commodity-driven deforestation is close to zero in the United States. It doesn't even show up on this chart that they produce on the left-hand side here. In fact, right across the US in the years 2022 and 2021, about 17,000 hectares of forest were converted into agricultural land right across the US. And that's both softwood and hardwood forests everywhere across the states. And that amounts to about 0.005% of the total forest area, and only about 0.2% of the disturbances resulted in a conversion to agriculture. So I think by normal standards, that would be considered a negligible risk of deforestation in accordance with the EUDR definitions. And not only do we know the actual amount of deforestation, we know where it is as well. We know where it is using some very high quality forest inventory data, which is produced, updated every year by the US Forest Service. They operate this thing called the Forest Inventory Analysis Program. And the data there does very clearly identify where forests are expanding and what's driving deforestation in different areas. And this data shows that in of 3,000 counties across the United States, there was only 14 counties in the last sort of 10-year period where there was a risk of conversion to agriculture, of forest to agriculture. So we know we've got a very low risk, and we know precisely where that risk is at a county level. Um, and actually, this is gross deforestation as well. It's not taking account of net deforestation. Even in these counties where we're seeing conversion of forest to agriculture, we're also seeing conversion of agriculture to forest in a lot of these areas. So there's actually very little risk of deforestation in the sector which we're dealing with here. So, okay, that's the underlying situation. It's very low risk, but actually it's very, very difficult to conform to the specific technical requirements of the EUDR because the text of the law is very difficult to conform with. When you're dealing specifically with non-industrial forest owners, it becomes very, very challenging indeed. But we are developing a framework that will enable all consignments of products containing US hardwood to be accompanied by the documentation needed to demonstrate legal and deforestation-free origin, including geolocation data, although that geolocation does not meet the strict definition of the plot of land in the EUDR. But we're doing the best we can to provide a very good assurance, very robust assurance, both of deforestation-free status and legality. And the system involves a very detailed annual deforestation assessment where we will identify and update the data on county level trends in deforestation using some good quality satellite data, the Sentinel-2 satellite data, which is at 10-meter resolution. That analysis we will be able to update every single year so that we will get a very clear picture of exactly where deforestation is happening and what is actually driving that deforestation, which commodities are driving that deforestation. Because obviously one of the big things about EUDR, it's looking particularly at conversion to agriculture. The hardwood sector is not necessarily driving deforestation, but it might inadvertently find itself in areas where hardwood wood comes from forests which have been driven by other commodities. And we obviously have to be aware of that. The second thing the system does, it involves undertaking, we commissioned 33 legality assessments for each of the US hardwood producing states. These have been undertaken by a third party. They're being prepared in line with a specification which was developed very much in line with the EUDR legality definitions. The third party is a company called Dovetail Partners, very expert in risk assessment, probably quite well known to the wider industry. They are doing very detailed risk assessments of legality risk at the level of individual states in the United States. And those risk assessments will actually specify where there is a risk and also provide guidance on mitigation measures. The third element of the system we're developing is a web portal for US hardwood producers and traders that provides all the access to legality and deforestation data, and also will generate a standardized due diligence statement, which as far as possible is designed to be conformant with the EUDR requirements. And then fourthly, this is something that's going to take a little bit longer. We are going to develop a global chain of custody standard, which will set out risk mitigation actions by the mills that are required to reduce both deforestation risk and illegality risk, and will also set out requirements to control legal and deforestation-free claims throughout the supply chain. This is just illustrating some of the data that we have access to. The US is fortunate in having very good quality public data. Actually, this is a public data set, the USDA cropland data layer, which looks at which actually every year is updated and shows exactly what crops are being grown on what piece of land. It also shows where crops are growing on land that was formerly under forests. And this data is updated, as I say, every single year, and it's publicly available. The system that we're developing is using a higher grade version of the cropland data layer that's updated more regularly, and it's a higher level of resolution. And we will use that to identify trends at the level of individual counties. You see here the boundaries on this map here, they're actually the county boundaries, and we're using them as the basis for our analysis. Um, and we're also using it as the basis for our geolocations. The system at the end of the day will provide hardwood exporters that are registered on the system. They will be able to provide geolocation data with every consignment, which will include the polygons of the supplying counties and the year of harvest. And as we heard, we did hear some details earlier on. That does not meet the strict interpretation of the law. We understand that. But at the same time, we feel this is an appropriate level of detail in the context of a very low risk supply source when you're dealing specifically with small non-industrial forest owners. This is the most practical way to do it. We think county level data is manageable in terms of there are 1,360 counties across the US that account for about 99% of hardwood supply, much easier than trying to deal with 9.5 million forest owners. Incidentally, we think providing county level data provides equity in relation to state forest areas and tropical concessions and industrial plantations, which actually in those contexts, if you look very closely at EUDR, there's a lot of flexibility in how they can define the plot of land for the provision of geolocation data. You get we need specificity in that law when we're dealing with wood from inside single real estate properties, because that's what the law says. You have to have geolocations inside individual real estate properties, which means that under the terms of the law, we should be providing very disaggregated, highly detailed, highly specific data, which in practice, in the sector that I'm dealing with, at any rate, that is almost impossible to achieve. And it also leads to considerable problems with regard to legal liabilities if you have one of those individual points for many reasons over which you have no control. If that becomes recognized as and identified as having deforestation risk, then everything that includes that single point becomes effectively non-compliant with EUDR. The other thing that we think is very important is that we will be able to apply technologies like trace element analysis, stable isotope ratio analysis, that you're undertaking a simple scientific test, a lab test of individual samples of wood. You can use these technologies to identify provenance with a relatively high level of resolution, about actually, incidentally, the level of resolution of a single county in the United States, if you've got a decent timber sample database. So if you really want to check the provenance and be sure that it's coming from a particular county, in time, we will be able to deliver that through these provenance technologies. And in fact, we're very active in trying to build a timber sample database that will allow a simple scientific of a test of a piece of wood coming out of a factory wherever in the world, in Vietnam, in China. And if it's American hardwood, you will be able to identify the precise county from which it comes and be able to link it very closely with the deforestation-free data that we have available. The counties are sufficiently compact to ensure a homogeneous level of deforestation risk, which actually is one of the requirements of the plot of land in the definition in the EUDR. And actually, this approach also resolves a lot of confidentiality and antitrust issues surrounding the provision of data on individual properties. And that's a big deal in the United States, a lot of legal requirements around antitrust and confidentiality. Very briefly, I know I haven't got very long, probably about 2 minutes. Can I extend my presentation for 5 minutes? Is that okay? Or do we need to stop now?
Maybe very quickly, Rupert. Yes, please do.
Okay, well, I'll just very quickly say that we're running this project in 2 phases. The first phase is to establish a web portal. This will be specifically for US exporters. This will be available by November. And this will allow exporters, it's very much an adaptation of a system we already have called the American Hardwood Environmental Profiling System. We're extending this so that it can effectively provide a due diligence statement, which is as in line with the EUDR requirements as close as possible, and it will provide and generate the geolocation data for the county polygons, and that will be provided with each consignment supplied into the EU and into the wider global market. And we will aim for that system to be fully compatible with the EU information system, with, of course, the reservation that the polygons will be at county level, not at individual real estate property level. The longer term, we will develop this chain of custody standard and extend the web portal by the middle of next year. And this will be, the aim will be to extend the web portal so it can be used both for registered users upstream of the exporters and also downstream of the exporters, and will also be a tool for the primary hardwood processors and log exporters. They will be made responsible for identifying the specific counties of origin, and also for undertaking measures to mitigate the risk of sourcing illegally harvested wood, and also to mitigate any risks of wood coming from areas converted to agriculture. We are seeking very specific changes to the EUDR. We are lobbying for this to happen. We're actually very closely engaged with the US government in efforts to achieve this alongside trading partners elsewhere. We think these are the things that we'd like to see in the law, which would make it much more effective, in our view. Actually removing this reference to within a single real estate property in the definition of a plot of land, so that you are allowed to use jurisdictional areas, for example, or mill supply areas, or in fact, indigenous peoples areas, which actually none of these terms actually fall within the definition of a single real estate property. And bearing in mind that something like 75% of the world's forest is in public owner, it's not real estate at all. This whole reference to single real estate properties really doesn't make much sense in the forest sector. There are other requirements we think this law should include. There should be a de minimis definition. At the moment, it has a sort of zero tolerance to any level of risk. There should be, we believe, a time limit for liability post-harvest at the moment, because under the current law, forest products operators are actually having to look into the future. They're having to assess a possible future event. If they buy timber from a private owner, how will they be sure that in 3 or 4 years' time that forest is not converted? Or if it's left fallow for a while, how will they know it's going to be replanted as opposed to converted to an agricultural crop? There's this real problem of time scale involved with this law. And also, we think there should be limits to liability of wood product suppliers when deforestation is driven by non-wood commodities. In the US, actually, the conversion is not being driven by the wood, by the hardwood specifically. It is being driven by the soy, by the wheat, by the onions in Georgia, for example. One of the issues is that some of the forests are being converted over for onion production, which of course is not even regulated by EUDR. So should the hardwood exporter be responsible for conversion by other commodities which are not even regulated by the law? So these are all issues that we're raising now, and we are using whatever mechanism we can to leverage some of these changes. Thank you. I shall leave it there.